Thanks. Just want to make sure, can everybody hear me? Because I'm going to be like Jeff, I'm going to wander around a lot. So if I don't have to be behind the mic, I would prefer not to do that. Yeah, and before I get started, I also wanted to thank John so much for bringing 360 IDEV back again to the East Coast and especially the Southeast. As someone who lives in this area, it's a real treat to be able to just hop in a car and drive to a conference and not have to deal with flights and stuff like that. And I'd also like to thank Ryan and his crew for continuing to advocate, aka pester, John into having 360 IDEV men here in Greenville. Lastly, I also wanted to take a moment to thank Juliana for the talk she gave last year on this very subject, because it was a combination of her talk and another one that I saw that really helped, in a sense, elevate my awareness on this subject and make me realize not only how important it is, but when you deal with it correctly, I'm not going to say it's an easy problem to solve, but it's a problem that's easily solvable in a sense. And it's something that we all need to be aware of throughout the entire design and development process of our apps. And then specifically for me, I've been working for about the past 5 years or so within the healthcare industry, building apps for them. And for the past 2 years, building apps specifically for patients, for consumers. And so the subject of accessibility and making our apps available to the largest audience possible is a real factor that we include when we're building our applications. So how many of you happen to catch the Apple event yesterday? Right? So dongle proliferation aside, I thought it was incredibly powerful how they began that presentation. They began that presentation on this very subject of accessibility and how important it is to the DNA of Apple and the apps that they build, the operating systems that they build, to make sure accessibility is like a first-class citizen in everything they do. And to see someone interact with an application as complex as what I believe was probably Final Cut Pro using a simple switch control just blew my mind, because I think it blows away any kind of excuses we could come up with as app developers to say, my app is too complicated for someone who can't interact with a touchscreen to use, so I'm just not going to mess with accessibility. I mean, we can't fall back on that crutch anymore. We need to take the subject as serious as it needs to be. And finally, accessibility is a subject that I think, because it is important because it cuts through all boundaries, social, racial, ethnic, gender-based boundaries. Accessibility is an issue that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not. It's something that really humanizes us. Now, some of you may be wondering okay, accessibility, I hear this word mentioned a lot all over the place. What does it actually mean? Well, if you looked it up in like a design or UX source, you probably end up with a definition that looks something like this. Designing products, devices, services, or environments for people who experience disabilities. And that's certainly a comprehensive definition that covers the gamut of what accessibility addresses. But in their redesign of their accessibility website yesterday, I found this definition that Apple provided to be much more, touched me much more closely, which is Apple approaches accessibility as simply this: designing products for everyone, not just some people or most people, but everyone. Okay? So take that into account when you're thinking about what accessibility means to you and the products that you build. I'd also like to start off by addressing some common misperceptions that people have about accessibility and some of the excuses that they might use to not address it as important as the important subject that it is. Or misconceptions that give them a false definition of how to deal with it. And the first one is this: we should not treat accessibility as something that's simply an on and off switch. It is not a factor that you can think of something is accessible or it's not accessible. Accessibility is a gradient. It's a range, okay? And whether we realize it or not, we all exist somewhere on the spectrum of accessibility. Even something as simple as going into your iOS settings and bumping the font size up a little bit. That changes where you exist on this accessibility spectrum, because that's actually an accessibility setting within iOS. And as we age, something I'm dealing with, of course, but as we age, where we exist on this accessibility spectrum changes. Our eyesight changes, our physical abilities change. So it's not something that is simply just a fixed point in time. It's a spectrum that we kind of move back and forth on depending on where we happen to be on our own kind of physical and mental capabilities at any given time. It's also important not to treat accessibility as this big designer versus developer battle, right? You can't just say accessibility, that's something for designers to work with. They need to make sure they use the right colors or the right fonts. And designers can't just say, well, you developers need to use the right API calls in your iOS apps to make sure that you're supporting, say, Voiceover correctly. As with most things in app development, it works best when you come together as a team, work together, collaborate, and realize accessibility is something that exists on both sides of the designer and developer divide. Now, accessibility covers a huge spectrum of issues, but for today, I just wanted to cover 4 issues that specifically affect people who have vision impairments. There are other areas that accessibility covers, more like motor skill development and kind of developmental skill development. A lot of those topics are require more of like subject matter experts to really deal with, because they have a lot to do about how you present, like how you formulate the information that you're presenting in your app. Whereas vision impairments, I think, there's something that all of us can more closely relate to, because it affects more closely with how our apps are laid out, how they're designed, and not so much about understanding kind of the educational content that goes into how you build your apps. But before we get into it, I'd like to walk you through a quick thought experiment. So let's say the magical point happens where someone comes to you and says, hey, guess what? We're going to give you full reign to build your dream app. You're going to be able to do everything you want. We're not going to put any limits on you. You're going to be able to control every aspect of both the design and development of this app. All right, so I don't know what that app means to each of you in this room, but kind of take a moment, kind of picture it in your mind and think about, okay, if someone were to really do that, allow that, what would this app be, okay? What kind of decisions would you make about key topics like the style, the layout, the fonts, the color palette that you're using? What technologies would you adopt when you're building your apps? What interaction standards would you follow? What kind of design trends would you adopt and extend? All these things kind of come together and kind of dictate where your priorities lie when it comes to building the application, right? So all these things factor together. So inevitably what it comes down to, like I said, is where are your priorities when it comes to designing and building the applications? Now, miraculously, unlike everything else that happens in the real world, your app actually gets finished on time and you're ready to deploy it into the App Store. Everyone's excited. But something strange happens. As you are deploying it, you are now transformed into a completely different person that you have no control over whatsoever. Okay? You might end up being someone who is older or younger, someone who is a different race, ethnicity, or gender. You could be among the estimated 285 million people who deal with visual impairments. Now, your vision could be worse than it is today. So a UI that might look okay to you when you built it might be a little bit harder for you to read as someone who is suffering from vision loss. So they could be someone like 65% of the population suffers from or has vision that's less than 20/20 or perfect. As we age, even when we're younger and we can see well, as we age, the actual physical shape of our eyes change, and that affects how well we can see, how well we can focus on small text. And what happens even more drastically is that our sensitivity to light decreases dramatically. a lot of studies say that by the time you reach age 60, your eyes can only process about 30% of the light that they used to be able to process when you were, say, age 25, right? So that means that things need to be approximately like two-thirds brighter than they need to be now than they were back then when you were younger. And basically what these two things combine into is that you become much more sensitive to smaller text, and you become much more sensitive to text contrast and how when text is placed above other colors or imagery, how hard is it for you to actually read that text. So as you can see here, what used to be, I don't know if this projector's picking it up, but what used to be kind of legible in your original designs might not be so much now. And so some of these titles, because of the way they're being placed on imagery, because of light sensitivity, you may not be able to actually read them anymore. What if you suffer from something like color blindness, right? You cannot necessarily decipher or distinguish between certain colors in the color spectrum. This is something that affects about 4% of the population, and especially men, where it affects 1 in 12. And there are different types of color blindness based on how the color sensing cones in your eyes are affected. So you might not be able to distinguish between red and green. I think that's the most popular one, but there are also other versions of color blindness that you can suffer from. You know, if color is an important element of your application, when you were making decisions as to what your color palettes would be, if you're now someone who suffers from color blindness, could you still use your app? You know, did you design a color palette in a way that took this into account? You know, and finally, what if you can't see the screen at all? Right? What if you're one of the 35 million people who are living with blindness or nearly complete vision loss? And so your primary interaction with applications is through technologies like Voiceover. So with all these things in mind, all of those priorities you placed up front when you were building your app, were they prioritized in such a way that now that you're a completely different person who has different abilities, could you still be a user of this amazing app that you built, something you thought like revolutionized the mobile industry? And I don't mean this as a example of something to kind of diminish our decision making. I think it's just something to elevate the awareness of some other things we need to be taking into account when we're designing and developing our apps. Now, this whole little thought experiment is a very rough adaptation of what 20th century philosopher John Rawls called the veil of ignorance. And in his original essay, this was actually something that he was applying towards the creation of social contracts by governments, right? So when they're designing laws and things like that, he was saying, how different would our laws be if the people who made those laws were now suddenly, as those laws came into effect, were now suddenly transformed into the people who had to live under those laws. Knowing that, how would they change their decision making? And in a sense, I think that, when we're building apps, that's kind of like a contract between us and our users. It's something that we need to be aware of. And I think by considering this scenario, it serves to not only elevate our awareness of it, but it also serves to help make us more compassionate about what other people are dealing with. And as a result, it comes down to the difference between when we're compassionate about something, we also develop this desire to do something about it and actually take action and improve it. So it's not enough just to know about the situation. We need to be compassionate about the situation and make the necessary changes to affect and improve the situation. Okay, so thought experiment aside, let's get back into those 4 issues. So I identified these 4 issues because I feel like these are ones that if we take them into account early enough in the design and the development process, when we get to the end, we'll find that it really wasn't a lot of work to actually address these issues and end up with a result that not only that most of our audience can use, but also expands that audience to people who might have vision impairment. All right, first topic. Everybody read that? No? How about now? Text size? Okay, so this one's a gimme. This one's pretty easy. I think the main rule here, just use larger fonts, okay? I think that, you know, when we're designing, in some of the design tools we use, it's very easy to forget that these designs that we're mocking up on these gigantic, you know, 27-inch Retina displays that Apple doesn't make, but you gotta buy from somebody else, but that's another subject. It's very easy to forget that this, you know, huge screen that I'm looking at is actually going to be displayed on this, you know, 4 or 5-inch display that I'm holding in my hand. So text that you see on when you're designing it, you might think it's large enough, but on the actual devices it's not. Okay, you're not hurting anybody by using larger fonts, but you are inhibiting adoption of your app as you go smaller and smaller. So just whenever possible, think about bumping up font size. It's a very simple and easy solution that you can use to address this problem. I mean, heck, just look at the way some of the key redesign in iOS 10. You know, here I've got news and music and photos. I mean, look at the size of the fonts used in these apps now. They're big, they're bold. These are much larger than those thin, wispy fonts that we're used, typography that we're used to seeing in previous incarnations of iOS, especially in iOS 7, right? But what's great about this is that just as much information, if not more information, is being displayed on the screen despite the fact that these fonts are bigger. It's just a reimagining of, if we take typography and font size into account, how can we reimagine the interface and elevate the most important stuff to the top? And like on a personal note, you know, this is what the Maps app looks like now, and I was using this app yesterday on my drive here, and I absolutely love the redesign in iOS 10 for this. It is so much more readable when you're actually in a vehicle driving, because the fonts are so much bigger and the contrast is so much larger between the fonts and the backgrounds that are used in the app. And you might think that, well, there isn't as much information being displayed on the screen now that they're using larger fonts, but that's not true. All of the relevant information, if not more, is still present on the screen compared to the previous versions of the Maps app. And especially, like I said, within the context of driving somewhere, not only does this help make the app more accessible, but also makes it far more usable in the environments that you're probably going to use it in. So this is an example of, you know, as a result of redesigning for the context that something's being used, that also improves the accessibility of the app. All right, so how do we fix text size issues? So I'm breaking each of these sections down into what can developers do, what can designers do. Designers, challenge yourself never to drop below, say, a 14-point font size in your app. Studies have shown that anything below 14 point can begin to drastically reduce the number of people who have, or increase the number of people who have issue reading the text on the screens. Also, try to break away from this need to really kind of lock down your design and make sure everything is pixel perfect. You need to be more flexible and adaptable in your design so that if people want to change the text size and the iOS settings, that your UIs can adapt to those different font sizes. Developers, I think it's key that you support modern OS features like dynamic text. Okay, so allow people to go into settings, change their font sizes, and allow those font sizes to be, font size changes to be reflected in your applications. And as a result of supporting dynamic text, you'll also want to, you know, if you're not already, take advantage of auto layout, self-sizing cells for table views and collection views. I mean, Apple has done a lot of work into trying to make this stuff kind of just magically work for you. You just have to make sure that you're building your UIs in a way that can take advantage of these, you know, modern features, but they've actually kind of been around for a while. So it's not like these are brand new things that you need to adopt. There's a lot of great examples out there on how to use auto layout, self-sizing cells if you're not already doing so. Now, text size ties very closely into the next topic, which is the topic of text contrast. Okay? So just as important as the size of your text, it's also important to make sure that when you're placing text on other colors, that you're using the appropriate contrast ratio between those colors. So here's an example of the same text and how placing it on a different background color greatly affects the readability of the text. Now, hopefully most of you can read what's being said on the top example, but it's far more difficult to read that one than it is to read what's on the bottom. So this is an example, a couple of examples of how not to do it and how you should be doing it. And basically that's just taking into account when I'm placing text on a colored background, what is the ratio of those two colors? And there are lots and lots of tools online to help you compute these values. It comes down to basically like the luminosity of the two colors and how they relate to each other. And we can leverage a lot of research that's been done for years in the web world on the subject of accessibility and text contrast. Studies have found that the ideal contrast ratio is 7:1, and with a minimum of 4.5 to 1. So when you're when you're coming up with your palette, your color palettes, and designing, when I'm placing text and labels on the screen, what's going to be the background color versus the foreground color? Run those colors through the various kind of contrast tools you can find online and make sure that you're falling within those range. Now, if you follow the first rule of making your fonts bigger, you can actually go to 3:1 when it comes to your color contrast ratios, because as fonts get bigger and thicker, they're now actually more easily readable in scenarios where smaller, thinner fonts couldn't be seen before. So in my previous example, if I had changed the top font to be a larger or bolder white text on that same light gray background, it actually might have been just as legible as what was below it. And then the other thing you really need to take into account is if you're designing an app that's going to overlay text on imagery, this is an area you need to be especially aware of. Based on what that imagery looks like, it could greatly affect the legibility of your text. So a couple of really simple solutions you can apply here. Maybe apply filters to your text. This might be a little bit drastic, so now you can't see your image, but maybe you can find that balance between darkening the background and elevating the text in the foreground color. Or if that's too complicated and the kind of the array of different imagery is too difficult to come up with a good tint or gradient to apply, you could take the easy way out and simply specify a solid color background for your text, or maybe even consider moving the labels underneath the text altogether and just get rid of that problem, not have to deal with it. Okay, so how do we address the issue of text contrast? Like I said, designers, it's very important when you're coming up with your color palettes to make sure those color palettes fall within the expected contrast ratios for color. Aim for 7:1, don't go any worse than 4.5 to 1. Like I said, if you are dealing with things like text on top of imagery, be very aware of that and make sure that whatever solution you take for that is going to take into account the legibility of that text. For developers, there are a couple of key accessibility flags that you should be checking in your app. One is related to whether or not the user has issues viewing text on top of transparent backgrounds. It's the UI accessibility is reduced transparency enabled. If you see that this flag is on, consider changing your app so that any backgrounds that were transparent now become something that's a little bit more solid color. That would allow those users to read your apps, the text within your apps more easily. The other one is the UI accessibility darker system colors enabled. This means this is the user saying that they would prefer you to use kind of thicker, bolder fonts in your app. So this could be something where you might choose to use bold fonts in a place where you would typically just use the normal fonts. A lot of us might have structured our code in such a way that we have like a class that manages our settings, our colors, definitions, our fonts, and things like that, kind of like CSS would for the web. So you could very easily switch on these two things down inside of that code, so that when the app is saying, "Hey, I need a primary label font," Well, down in the code that's actually taking that primary label font and saying, okay, it's actually, system font of size X, it's now system bold font size of X or something like that. So you could very easily, allow the user to make those changes and have them be reflected very quickly within your application. Issue 3, color blindness. Okay, let's play another game. All right, this game is what's in the cart. So, who thinks that they could tell me with a lot of confidence what 3 things are in this cart, simply based on color? How about now? Okay, now I can sort of make out that the middle one's probably tomatoes, right? The other 2, I don't know. I mean, they sort of look like red potatoes, and I don't know. The other side almost looks like potatoes too, I can't tell. How about now? Yeah. Limes, I don't know. So, in the end, this is what those 3 things were, okay? Oranges, tomatoes, limes. And the point of this little exercise is to remind us that for a lot of places, color alone is insufficient to convey context, right? So how would you feel if you were someone who suffered from color blindness and you went into your local grocery store, you went to the produce section, and nothing was labeled, right? They just assumed, oh, everybody can tell the difference between these limes and those potatoes or those tomatoes, right? You go into a grocery store, everything is labeled, right? And it's the combination of those 2 that makes sure that everyone who's existing in this environment understands what's happening. And we need to be aware of this as well within our own apps, okay? So don't simply rely on color when you're trying to convey intent. And so what does that actually mean? So here's a simple example of something you might show in your app. The user performs an action, it does a background task, and maybe there's like a little window shade that comes down to give you an update of what your action, whether or not it worked or not. And you think, oh, I know, I'll just give it a green background color if everything was okay, and a red background color if it failed. And that way, when it pops down, the user doesn't even have to look at it or read it. They can just say, oh, some green thing just flashed up there, so that means everything's good. Or if it was red, then I'll know, oh, what just happened? I might need to fix that. Well, guess what? If it's someone who deals with color blindness, this is what those 2 look like to them, right? And so in that scenario, that just doesn't work at all, right? So in this situation, we were designing it in such a way that we were relying solely on color to convey the intent of whether something worked or did not work. But there are a couple of easy things we could do to fix this situation. First, maybe just label the items a little bit more explicitly, right? So in the success case, actually say, success, this thing happened, or failure, this other thing happened. Please ignore the spelling mistake slide. So you're still requiring the user to actually read it a little bit more, but now, unlike the top one where the 2 really don't have a lot of differences between them, the middle one is much more explicit in what happened. Or consider using iconography, right? This is a very easy way to address it as well. So simply putting a common icon in front, and in this case, check mark for everything's okay, exclamation for hey, something just happened, I don't know, you might want to look into this. That just as well will help users decipher the intention between these 2 things, even if the color of what's being shown behind them isn't also conveying that intent. So this is a scenario that would pass our color blindness tests. All right, so for this particular topic, color blindness, I think this is an area that, for the most part, is something that designers have the most effect on. So they need to be very aware of this situation when they're designing their color palettes. There are a lot of online tools that will let you load up a palette, and then they'll give you the variations of that palette based on the different types of color blindness that people can be dealing with. So test them against those, and then also, like we're showing, when you're designing how your interactions work with the user, make sure you're not just solely relying on color to convey your intentions. And so that can be, like we said, adding additional text, being more explicit, adding icons. You could consider inverting the color, the foreground and background colors for kind of the negative cases. Like an example that in one of the apps I was working on, we were displaying lab results to users. And in your lab results maintain a lot of tests and things that we run. And those tests usually have a range of normal values. And when something fell outside of the normal range, we would display the value in red. And we're like, oh, this makes it very easy for people to see, oh, what's normal and what's out of range. Well, if people can't see, they have red, green color blindness deficiencies, to them, all of those values all looked gray. They didn't realize that some of them were red. And in that case, all we simply did was for the out of range values, we displayed them with a red back, we inverted it. So now instead of just being a piece of gray text, it was now a red box with the text inside of it. And so now whether you could see colors or not, you could easily scan through that list and quickly see which ones are highlighted differently. Right? So that was something that we, once we realized the situation, it was like a 5-minute fix to put in. Okay, now the biggie. Blindness and near vision loss. This one's tough, and you might think that it takes a lot of work, rightfully so, to make your apps usable for people who suffer from blindness or vision loss. But luckily and thankfully, this is an area that Apple is very, very serious about, and they built out for us an incredible technology known as Voiceover. If you're not familiar with Voiceover, I hope most of you are, at least, but for those that aren't, Voiceover has been built into iOS from the very beginning. It's an extremely powerful screen reader and navigator, and its power comes in its ability to kind of decouple views that are on the screen and the interactions with those views from the pixels that represent them on the screen. So for most people, if they want to tap a button, they have to locate where that button is located on the screen and actually kind of interact and tap right there within those icons. With VoiceOver, it makes that separation, so now the entire screen becomes an area for the user to interact with, and they're simply going through and selecting the element first that they want to act upon. And so it allows people to leverage the entire screen and use this really rich kind of gesture vocabulary to interact with all the various ways that we could be presenting information and controls within our apps. Now, if you're anything like me, the first time you enable this by default, your first thought was, oh my God, what's wrong with my phone? Please turn this off. I have no idea what's happening. And it took a long time for me to actually go back to it because it scared me away so much. But now's the time, if you haven't already, you really need to become familiar with VoiceOver and learn how to use it. And when it comes to this subject, there are 2 excellent talks that you can refer to. The first one was Laura Savino at LayersConf last year. And then also from last year, our very own Juliana gave an incredible talk on accessibility and some of the applications that she's been involved with and how they addressed accessibility within them. Both of these talks, rather than just kind of try to explain it in text and pictures, for VoiceOver it's very important that you see it in use. So refer to these 2, and I think once you watch both of them, you'll have a much better understanding of how to use VoiceOver. Developers. So previously for color blindness, that was something that I think designers need to focus on. When it comes to VoiceOver, this is something that developers can really focus on. So the semantic information that VoiceOver extracts from your UIs actually comes from the properties defined in UI accessibility protocol. And I like to break these into like the who, why, when, and what's of accessibility. So the label, for me, is the who. It's a short word. Who are you on the screen? It's a short word or phrase that succinctly describes what that object on the screen is. The value is the what. Okay, what is your current value right now? Frame is the where. Where are you on the screen and how big are you? Now, you might not think that if someone's not directly interacting with the pixels, why does that matter? Well, that matters because that tells VoiceOver where to draw the accessibility cursor as it's navigating through all the elements on the screen. Traits are interesting. They're the how. So they tell the user how they can interact with it. Is this a button they can tap on? Is this a slider they can move up and down? Is it something they can't interact with, like a label or a header? And finally, hint is the when. When I interact with you, what can I expect to happen? So if it's not something that the user can decipher based on the other properties, like the label or the value or the traits, you can optionally provide a hint to let the person know, okay, you need to do this in order to perform a certain action. Okay. All right. So developers, you might be thinking this is going to be a lot of work, right? Now I got to go through all my views and set up all these values. Actually, that's not the case. You're going to get a lot of this functionality for free because UI View already implements this protocol, and based on the values you assign to your views, it's going to automatically pull out reasonable defaults to apply to these different properties. So now as a developer, it's really just up to you to go through and make sure those reasonable defaults that are being applied make sense within the context of your app. And if not, then you can go in and kind of reassign them based on a better awareness of how your app actually works. All right, so I'm going to run through a quick example of how this actually sounds in real life, so you can kind of hear the differences between the labels, the traits, the hints, and things like that. So I'm going to try to keep this together. Hopefully I'm still paired with the speakers.
Voiceover on.
Right.
Settings.
Okay, so the first one, display and brightness.
Display and brightness. Heading.
Okay, so in this case, display and brightness is the label attribute, and header is the trait. So by saying this is a header, it allows the user to know I can't really interact with it. This is just for display purposes.
Settings. Back button.
All right, settings is the label, back button is the trait. By saying it's a button, it allows the user to know that I can now tap on that object.
Screen brightness. 55%. Adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value.
All right, so this one's using 3 of those properties. It's using screen brightness for the label, 40% is its value, and swipe up or down to adjust the value, that's the hint. So it lets the user know I need to go
65%. 75%. 65%. 55%.
right? So it's letting me know, okay, this is a slider, well, how do I change the value for that slider? And as I change it, you can hear it read back those new values to me.
Auto brightness. On. Double tap to toggle setting.
Okay, once again, auto brightness, that's my label. On is the current value, and double tap to toggle settings, that's my hint. So I know that I can double tap anywhere on the screen
Off. On.
and have it change the value of that switch control.
Apps. Settings. Active. Settings. Auto brightness. On. Double tap to toggle setting.
All right, so this, although programmatically this is something developers have to deal with, I think understanding how to use VoiceOver is something we all need to do regardless of our role in a given project. You need to be able to use VoiceOver to the point where you can actually engage what's called the privacy curtain, and it will basically turn the whole screen off, and now the whole screen is black. Okay? So challenge your team. Can they take that app and perform the most valuable taps in that, valuable actions in your app using solely VoiceOver? And if not, reconsider what you need to do to address that issue. Developers, with the release of Xcode 8, there's this awesome new accessibility inspector tool. It'll basically allow you to do an audit of an entire screen at once, and it'll inform you of any accessibility deficiencies that view might have and how you can easily address them. This is much faster than the way you used to do it, which is go through view by view and just listen to how it actually sounds in VoiceOver. And like I said earlier, UI views are going to define really good defaults for you, but if you find any that don't really jive with the way that your app works, go in and customize those properties as you need to. All right, so quick summary. So today, these were the 4 areas that we covered, and I hope that I've shown that these are things that you address early on in the design and the development process. That in the end, it's just not a lot of work. It's just being aware of the situation, taking those into account, and then allowing those to affect your design and your development in the priority that they need. Accessibility, like subjects like localization, accessibility is something that's far more difficult if you try to just tack it on at the end than it is if it's something that you address right up front and give it the importance and the priority that it deserves. And like I said originally, I work in the healthcare industry, so for me, the subject of accessibility, this stuff really matters to what we do. We want to make users' health data as accessible to them as possible. It's something that will greatly affect the improvements and the outcomes that physicians are trying to achieve with them. And in the end, accessibility just means that we're going to be far more inclusive in the number of people that can use our apps, right? And what's the opposite of inclusion? Well, that's discrimination. And I don't think any of us would actively discriminate against anyone wanting to use our app. But in a sense, that's what we're doing through inaction and not actually taking advantage of these accessibility features provided to us by the operating systems. And there are no downsides to doing this stuff. Rising tide raises all ships, right? Dealing with accessibility is not a zero-sum game. You're not going to lose some users because you're adding accessibility. It's going to increase your overall, the number of people who can use your app, and in a lot of ways might help you come up with a better UI in the end, even for people who aren't using the accessibility features, than it would have if you hadn't thought of it at all. Okay, so where can you go from here if you want to learn more? As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to learn more about how to use VoiceOver, please check out Juliana and Laura's videos. Those are located on the 360 site as well as the Layers Conference site. And this first one by Austin Seraphin was from a couple years ago at Coco Love. This is an extremely powerful video to watch. Austin is essentially legally blind. And so he got up and gave this talk about how accessibility has literally changed his life. Before the accessibility features built into iOS, a lot of mobile devices just were not usable to him. But now with iOS and the way that this is a really important concept within the operating system, it just opens up a whole new world of opportunities to him and people like him. So if you ever need some encouragement or a reason why to deal with this subject, go watch Austin's presentation. You will come away amazed by
Screen dimmed.
Thanks. You will come away amazed by what he's done. And finally, some resources within Apple itself. Yesterday Apple completely kind of redesigned and relaunched their accessibility pages on their website, so there's a ton of great information there. Every year since 2012, there's been at least 1 or 2 talks on accessibility, so make sure you check those out. And I know the HIG is important. You become an iOS developer, everyone just says you got to read the HIG. You're not a real developer until you read the HIG. I think in a lot of ways you may not be a real developer until you read and understand the accessibility programming guidelines either. This to me is just as important in a lot of ways as the HIG is. So take the time. It's a quick read, but it'll really elevate your awareness of this subject and how to take advantage of it in your apps. All right. So that's all I had for you today. Thanks so much. If you want to give me any feedback about what I spoke about today, these are the channels you can reach me, and I'll be posting slides of the talk at my website below. So, thanks, everybody.